Your kids are heading back to school. School resource officers may not be there to greet them. School security expert Mike Johnson is here sharing valuable tips to keep you switched on. We're going to talk about a very important subject, and that is security as it relates to school security, event security. Our philosophy at Switched On is no matter where you play or pray, we want you to be switched on. And Mike, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your company? I'd appreciate that.
Thanks, Eric, for having me on this morning. What we do is we work with schools, houses of worship, businesses, live events on what we call emergency planning management. And one of the core pieces of emergency planning management is what we call alerting and communication, which is all part of what we call situational awareness, which is being switched on.
And you've touched on it. If you fail to prepare, prepare to fail. And unfortunately, there's been events throughout this country that demonstrate the results of failure to prepare. And you were directly involved in the school shooting and the aftermath of that school shooting in Fort Lauderdale 3 years this year at MSD. And there were some key lessons learned from that shooting, and maybe you can share some of those lessons.
You know, it's interesting, Eric. Oftentimes people point to the aggressor or the attacker, which is certainly they're the ones doing the attack. But in many cases, certainly in the case of MSD, and you find any scenario around the world where an incident has occurred, that it ultimately comes back to the institution, school, church, wherever, not being prepared. Things are going to happen in society. Things are going to happen. Yeah, we call it getting left to boom. And what that essentially means is things are going to happen. So you have to prepare for when boom does happen.
Right.
It could be at the Capitol, certainly. Events could have happened, but with better planning, preparedness, it would have been a different outcome.
Mike, let me ask you this. Eric and I were talking before the broadcast today about, so in 2020, now school shootings were down, obviously, because schools were closed in large part. What in your view can we expect as students start to go back to the classroom? And certainly back to the classroom now was sort of a pent up situation going on now. They've been quarantined, they've been homeschooling for a long time. What do you think the end game is going to be that? And are you concerned there will be more school shootings as we progress?
Well, yes, I think there's a couple of issues going on. One, certainly a lot of kids have been isolated. They haven't been able to engage and interact with others other than on social media. Absolutely. So they haven't had that first to first. Right. Yes. So and I think the same can be said, John, for schools, churches, as people start coming back into contact. There's going to be a tremendous amount of fear, and with fear comes anxiety, and with fear and anxiety comes potential for more disruptions and threats. So schools, churches, everybody's got to be tuned into the fact that as society has changed during COVID, as we start going back, there needs to be a lot of attention paid to individual behaviors, because unfortunately people are going to be acting out because it's going to be an unusual situation. And I tell you, here's an idea on a simple, for my case, I walk a lot. And when I'm walking, I always say good morning to people, and people just literally turn their head.
Yeah.
And society has become so isolated. And with that is going to become, unfortunately, a chance for more aggressive behavior. And I think a lot of what we're seeing now is going to continue and probably get worse for a short period of time. But nevertheless, everybody's got to stay prepared, stay switched on, stay engaged, get out of the fear, get out of the anxiety, and work towards a common goal and solution that we all get society back to a normal place.
And Mike, you're spot on in that everyone's been quarantined, really disengaged with one another, and we know that depression and alcoholism is up, and now that kids are going back to school, what are they, how are they going to adjust now that they've been in this environment for the last, what, year or so of maybe disengaged? Now they're going to get re-engaged, and how are we prepared to deal with them?
Teachers are also going to need assistance because the teachers have been teaching remotely for the most part. And when they go back into live classrooms, they also have the same fears, concerns, anxiety that the kids will have. They may not act out as the same, but how is their response going to be to kids and to students back in the classroom? Are they going to have shorter tempers? So, unfortunately, in the United States, we don't spend enough time looking at social and emotional well-being of individuals,
Yes.
and we need to do that. You talk about in your platform being switched on, which has a lot of stability within yourself. But as a society, we're fearful of those emotional, social issues, and we just need to hit it straight on and understand that it's going to take a societal effort to come back from this.
Yeah, it takes a village, I would say, right, to
Yes.
make sure that
Well,
we're
yeah,
all
and,
safe.
and I think it takes some parents at home too. Like, what would you suggest as children get prepared to go back to school? What would you suggest parents do to prepare their kids? I mean, tips, helpful information. We know in high school, right? The last thing kids do is listen to the parent. But if they can support this and have thoughts for their children as they go back and some switched on tips, that could help, right?
So you think about this. I mean, I know a lot of parents who are keeping their kids isolated. If the parents are afraid to go to the grocery store, then the kid is going to be afraid to get out. But we have to start re-engaging society. And yes, we have to be aware that the uh, disruption with COVID is still out there, but we have to start thinking about re-engaging in society. These are all examples of everyday life that as you go through life, you have to be prepared, be it as an individual, as a corporation. And that just doesn't mean conducting a drill. It's maintaining that switched on behavior where you have situational awareness. It's knowing what's coming. It's having a means of alerting, and that's what our philosophy is based on. All of that
Yeah.
training, preparedness, and honestly, with the case of MSD, to circle back, had those school people been better prepared, it would have been a different outcome. People would have died, but not 17.
What was one of the key, if you could share, like maybe three top takeaways, lessons learned from that incident?
Well, certainly, I would say communication was probably the biggest issue, both in the stance of the type of communication they had. For example, it was 5 minutes into the shooting before they ever called for a lockdown or code red. So, lack of communication is number one. And I always put that as your number one issue when it comes to both methods and means of communication.
Right.
And the lack of preparedness and training on behalf of staff and students. They didn't know what to do when an incident occurred. And number three was just the failure of security overall. They had vulnerabilities that they never addressed. They left gates open. Security was asleep at the switch. And so those three things led to catastrophic outcome.
These are all hard lessons learned, and I hope we as a society understand if we're prepared, we stand a much better chance in surviving. And I want people to be switched on, as well as you want people to be ready and to respond to and to mitigate threats. Being prepared will save your life. If you're not prepared, unfortunately, when, as we say, poop hits the fan, the odds are someone's going to get hurt, and you're not going to be able to properly respond to that person. It's really about, again, communication and sitting down with your children and sitting down with them one on one and say, if you see something, say something to a teacher, to me, to another adult. And it's NYPD's philosophy that they've drilled into their people and their citizens for the last 25 years plus. But yes, we as a society need to speak to our kids, educate them, give them the tools that give them the knowledge that they can go to school, and if they see something, say something, and encourage them to say something, because it just might save a life.
Well, and you got to remember too, these kids have had nearly a year home, and with home, there's a certain amount of that, right? Is the homeschooling that's going on, but a big part of that is they've been on the internet. They've been in dark places. They've been unsupervised for a good amount of time.
Yes.
And you have to wonder what effect that'll have as these students come back into the classroom. So what should, in your view, Mike, given what you've seen and what your business is, what do you think teachers should look for as we move forward here? I mean, are there cue signs? Are there triggers? Are there things that those in the classroom should be looking for in their students as they come back into class?
Right. Circle back real quick to what Eric said about see something, say something. Unfortunately, and to segue into what you said, John, unfortunately, see something, say something has become comment on social media. And that's one of the big issues. That's not communication. Communication is what we're doing here, talking,
Right.
face to face. That's communication. Communication is not spouting something on social media where you're behind a computer and as you said, in a dark room. Well, the first thing, John, back to your question, is the teachers, they have to get to know the students now, because they probably, in most cases, they haven't seen students for a year. And so if you're a first grade teacher or a 12th grade teacher, you have to re-engage with the students. You have to get them all to know them all over again. And it's just like if you start the school year with a new class, what do? You have to take some time to understand who they are. What are their normal behaviors? What is abnormal? And that's going to be the difficulty. And as we transition from this online hybrid, whatever model you want to call it, into the classroom, the pressure is going to be on the teachers, who are also facing, as I said earlier, the same anxieties and fears. It's going to be incumbent on them to get to know the students, because a student may be exhibiting normal behavior, but it may be abnormal according to the teacher's way of looking at things.
We've spent billions of dollars on locks and bulletproof glass and what have you, but it really comes down to spending the time training the teachers and training even the students to identify and be able to respond and mitigate threats. Wouldn't you say?
So look at statistically, we know from the Center on Mass Violence Response studies that approximately 88 to 90% of all school attacks and shootings are what we call insiders. So that's a former student or a current student. So what does that tell you about your locks, alarms, and the billion-dollar industry that has been built up, sort of a fear-based, if you will, security? It's all internal. So it goes back to, again, having threat assessment teams that are doing evaluation of when a student is exhibiting behaviors of concern. That's reviewed by people who have been trained to what to look for, how to mitigate, and when to intervene. And that's the problem, is that we're not spending enough time looking inside to look for the potential threats and intervene before something happens.
I think what's going on now, obviously, is millions, tens of millions, in some cases hundreds of millions, is being spent on COVID prevention in classroom, ventilation systems and plexiglass, and training for COVID. I'm wondering if we're leaving the training for and the assets for school security behind, and could that be an issue? I mean, I would hate to see another mass school shooting for that to be brought up back to the forefront.
That's a big concern I talk to clients with, John, is that everybody's focused on COVID, and yes, and we've done we've done what we can do as a worldwide global society, being unprepared, but we're mitigating, we're vaccinating, but they're forgetting about all of those other threats and hazards, and you have to have a multi-hazard approach. And another thing that we're seeing is a lot of school districts in the U.S. now are removing police officers from the schools.
Yeah.
And the argument is, well, there are no threats. Well, wait till the threats come back. And so, society is being short-sighted, focusing so much on COVID, not thinking about the future threat. All of this is going to come back, unfortunately. And I tell the story about in the 1990s when I was working with schools overseas. I used to say schools are never attacked. Well, Columbine, Beslan changed that. Same thing with churches. Churches used to be a sacred place to go and worship your God or be in a safe place. Not anymore. They're being attacked every day. So we have to address that, and it's not to spread fear, and it's not to put huge fences around our churches. It's the same thing. It's train everybody to what to look for, to be switched on, to communicate, to prepare, to alert, and all the basic things. And if you do that, the more time and effort you put into the preparedness side, the less of a disaster effect is going to have when something happens.
I just think that as a society, we need to be better prepared, better switched on, and your company helps people around this country do that.
Mike, so you've been in this business for a long while. Obviously, how long have you been in the sort of the school protection business? You're a former federal agent as well, correct?
Right. I was 28 years in federal law enforcement and security. That's where I met Eric the first time overseas in Dubai. And but I've been working with schools for 30 plus years in various capacities. And about the last 10 years, I've really almost exclusively with schools around the world and helping to prepare them for disruptions that are going to happen.
Now, you mentioned churches as well. We did a podcast on the New York City shooting at a church, on the steps of a church at a holiday concert that happened a couple of months ago. And from that, we took away there's sort of a false sense of security when you go to your church, right? You go to worship.
Right.
You don't want to walk into mass or to your worship thinking, okay, how am I going to get out of here if a shooter comes in?
Right.
But I guess you should, right?
Well, I take my own example. So a couple of years ago, I joined a spiritual center. And it's not a traditional church in that sense, but it's a spiritual center, and they'll put 350 people in there every Sunday. And when I joined, they had never given any thought to safety or security. So of course now I run the safety team, and it's really about one of the things we focus on is training the volunteers, training the ushers to be switched on, and it's amazing how that has changed now. If they see somebody coming in that they don't know or that looks unusual, then they're going to tell us. I'll give you an example. So is myself or somebody from the safety team greets everybody every Sunday morning. And so if we see a backpack, we ask them to open it. It's that simple. And if there's behaviors of concern, which we have seen certainly during COVID, behaviors of concern, we look at it, we address it. And that's the way unfortunately you have to be. And Eric, your book is excellent, because you talk about all your life examples of being switched on and how that kept you alive all these years when you were working in some pretty tense situations. And it's something that in 2021 going forward, we all have to be that way.
Now, would you ask safety team at a church? I will tell you, I'm Catholic. I live up here in New England, and we have none of that. If I had my LTC, a license to carry, should I carry to church? And should a pastor or priest ask of the congregation, look, if you do have an LTC, carry? There was that shooting in Texas a couple of months ago at a church, and the last place you want to come into a church with a gun is in Texas, right? That bad guy was taken down pretty quick.
Well, I mean, we have a philosophy that we don't want guns in the sanctuary, and we put that in. I have the same.
I'm curious. Why is that?
It's
a lock on the door.
It's a threat-based approach, John, and I think that certainly if you're in a neighborhood where you have high crime and high incidence of robberies and things, that might be warranted. But as a general rule, I put a lot of emphasis on, again, getting left of boom, looking for those behaviors. We're in Florida. And if somebody walks in and they're wearing a heavy coat where they might be concealing a weapon, then obviously that's a tell. But the problem with congregants carrying weapons is the lack of training. You mentioned the case in Texas where the part of the safety team at the church dropped the guy in something like 6 seconds with a shot to the head. Well, Eric, you carried a gun for a long time, and so did I. Guess how much shooting that guy does? And
Right.
what I don't want is somebody that's got a concealed weapons permit being in the congregation, intervening so that we as a safety team can't deal with it, and then possibly getting shot or shooting an innocent bystander. We train for, if there's a disruption, how to deal with it, how to protect the stage. We have people that we train for this. And so I'd rather err on, focusing on my training and the training of my team to handle it than a bunch of people start pulling guns and get into the shootout.
Yeah, like if I go to mass, I want either you or Eric there with me. But if you're unlucky enough to be in that situation and somebody walks in and you don't have somebody who's switched on in that church, that could be an issue.
The pastor who pulled the gun on the vagrant was killed because the unarmed vagrant took the gun away from him and killed him.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. People are like, they're all like, oh, I'm carrying a gun, I'm macho man. How well trained are you? I mean, Eric and I, and probably you, John, we could take guns away from 80% of the people who pull it.
Well, I don't know about me. But man, I'll keep hanging.
Okay.
I'll keep hanging around with you guys, and it should be okay, I guess.
Yeah.
Your point is well taken, Mike, about people coming in who are not part of the team, who aren't have not been trained as part of as a team. I remember, and I'm sure you do, Mike, as well. Being on protection assignments, and we would be at an event, and let's say an agent or agents from another agency would try to come into the event armed, and we would say, no, you can come into the event, but put your weapons back in the G ride.
Because they haven't been briefed, they're not in the plan. Right?
Exactly.
Good point. Good point.
So many, even other agents coming into an event armed, we would say, you can come in, but your weapon has to be stored.
Right.
Because you're not part of the protection team. And so points well taken, Mike. I understand what you're saying, and I guess you would probably feel the same way about teachers being armed.
Well, that's funny. We there's a school in the area where we are up here in New England that that came up as a question, right? And the administration said there are no weapons on campus, but a lot of the teachers have decided that that they're going to carry, and for their own protection and for the protection of the students. So I wonder what your view might be along those lines. If it's one or two or three or four teachers in a school of 2,000, does it make sense to have a couple of guns on the premises? Certainly, as now, for clearly political reasons, we're pulling out school resource officers.
Well, you think about, Eric and I, former federal law enforcement officers. Generally, every 3 months, we were qualifying at the range with our sidearms, our long arms. So every 3 months, if you miss one range session, your skills degrade a little bit. So now you're talking about a teacher who might get 8 hours of training in a CWP class, and now they might shoot once a year to requalify. And it's the same thing. And they're carrying a semi-automatic pistol or a 5-shot revolver. The chances are bigger chance that someone's going to take it away from them and use it on themselves or others.
Right.
If you're going to do that, then I would expect the same level of training for a teacher that law enforcement officer that is on your campus gets, which is, again, every month, every quarter, and they're not going to do that. And John, do you really want the teachers thinking about the gun they're carrying or thinking about the behaviors of concern of those students?
Well, I wonder could the solution be mandating that those teachers who are carrying go through that training, and we have more guns in school from the protection side? The thought of school resources officers coming out of schools, which would be maybe the one or two weapons that could protect. So now, do you feel schools are a sitting duck, or do you feel with the proper prevention we don't need the gun on the protection side.
Go back to what I said earlier about 90% or so of threats are insiders. I'd rather the teachers and the administrators focused on behaviors of concern than worried about who's carrying a gun or who's not carrying a gun, because you're never going to reach a level where teachers are going to have this level of training that, say, a law enforcement officer has. The value in the school resource officers has become, it's less about the fact that they're carrying a gun. It's more about they've become really astute in most cases at identifying behaviors of concern, and almost in many cases, working with kids start to understand that law enforcement officers is not a bad person. And that's a great thing.
Yeah. Unfortunately, as of late, we've got a ways to go there because it seems like all the press that's been coming in from the other side has been teaching these kids differently, right?
But that's a value of having, a law enforcement officer on campus who develops relationships, and they realize that, that's not a bad person, and they're here for my safety. So, and as you said, unfortunately, but yeah, at the end of the day, I'm about training. I'm about preparedness. I'm about getting left of boom. And I just really don't want to see, unless the threat warrants it, I don't want to see guns, in the hands of civilians on school grounds, unless the threat dictates it.
So I guess what left of boom would be, so often these things happen, and it's said that, well, most of the kids in the class kind of thought it would be that kid that did it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we figured. There's no surprise to us. What do you do about that? Like, how do you track that? How do you make certain that if there are those threats, or look, Facebook has got algorithms that can tell you if somebody is suicidal. Are there algorithms that can tell you if somebody is potentially a school shooter, and can we access that, or should we be accessing that information?
I think back to my 28 years in law enforcement, and through those years, there were fellow law enforcement officers who were arrested for whatever it could be, for pedophilia or something, and inevitably it would be, I knew that guy was off, and this is the problem. As you say, almost every case, people knew there was something wrong and didn't say it, didn't report it, didn't communicate it.
Finishing up here, again, the top 3 lessons learned from that terrible, tragic incident at MSD 3 years ago this month. Let's just go over that again, because I want people to understand this didn't have to happen, and if it did, not so many people should have died. It should have been very few people dead that day, but unfortunately we saw horrific numbers. And how many people died that day?
17,
unfortunately. God bless them. So what are the 3, again, top takeaways from that horrific shooting?
Communication, what you say, how you say it, when you say it. Preparedness, that's planning, that's training, knowing how to respond to a disruptive event, threat, or hazard, and then mitigating your vulnerabilities. If you think about, and certainly having unreliable safety or security programs are part of your vulnerabilities, and the only way to lower risk is through mitigation. Your threats aren't going to change, and your assets aren't going to change. You have to mitigate your vulnerabilities, which is having a layered safety program. And again, it goes back to churches, businesses, houses of worship, live events. It's the same thing.
Outstanding, Mike. Again, we say it all the time. I say it all the time. No matter where you play or pray, I want you to be switched on. And I thank you, Mike Johnson, for your time today. Please go to ClearPath Alert, get more information, contact Mike. He offers a great service. I highly recommend it for your places of worship and schools. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
America in crisis. Defunding police. Murder rates rise. Overdoses and suicides skyrocket. Police are leaving the job. You, more than ever, need to be alert. Be ready. Be able. Be switched on. Switched On Life is a helpful guide for preparing you to be alert to danger, both in your physical and spiritual life.
identify, avoid, escape, live for another day.
Using Eric Caron's simple, switched-on philosophy about awareness gained as a highly trained special agent can change your life. In the blink of an eye,
You want cover.
in a moment of potential crisis, and over the course of one's life. Switched On Life will help you make the right decision.
So if you train the mind, the body will follow. If you don't train the mind, potentially you could die.
Switched On Life leads to greater personal and spiritual fulfillment.
Strengthen the soul through faith. Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to need that faith.
No matter where you play or pray, stay switched on.
Be safe. Stay switched on.
The Switched On Life podcast can be found at switchedonlife.com or where all fine podcasts are heard.